by many scholars as being the land of Punt, described by Egyptian chroniclers as a trading partner from over 5,000 years ago, Ethiopia is a country with ancient history and foreign relations that go way back. The modern era is believed to have started during the reign of Emperor Tewodros, but the foreign policy and diplomatic journey of Ethiopia has been evolving ever since, a matter we will look into today. Hello and welcome to Diplomatic Insights. I'm Kirana Baina, and today we will be looking at the diplomatic history of Ethiopia with African countries and within Africa in general. Our guest for today is a historian and a lecturer and researcher at Medawalabu University, Dr. Kafyalo Tasamma. Do stay with us. Dr. Tasamma, thank you very much for giving us your time for today. So, as you know, Ethiopia is a country with ancient history, and surely enough, there have been many instances of foreign relations. And keeping it specific to African countries, it goes way back. And let me give you the chance to give us a brief overview of Ethiopia's diplomatic history within the continent. What form did it take, and what the main objective was behind it?
Thank you for having me. Generally, going into Ethiopia's diplomatic history is not an easy task because Ethiopia is one of the oldest states on the continent, and it goes back to the pre-Christian era, or generally coming into Ethiopia's relation with the Middle East and Ethiopia's relation with Arabian or Islamic expansion. We can say that Ethiopia's relation with the outside world is part of the oldest places where human beings have lived. The case of Lucy's discovery is a brief example of the case. I can say now, coming to the modern diplomatic history, it is good to see Ethiopia's role with its neighbors, with African country, after the formation of, or after the establishment of several African states on the continent, particularly after the 1960s. We can start Ethiopia's a unique place in Africa's identity scenario. We can say, for example, that Ethiopia was and still is one patron of Africa's identity as a symbol of freedom, as a symbol of Africa's unshivering freedom seeker. This is one element or one point that, or one basic identity that Ethiopia stands for. The Ethiopians of the 19th century had strong differences, but they had been united by several factors that pushed them together against the foreign invasion, scramble of the Horn area. The identity that Ethiopia as a nation represents is an anti-colonial power. Adwa, for example, taking Adwa as a stage, is that Adwa is not the beginning where the Italians begin to be defeated by the Ethiopians. They started the Dogali case, we can say. We can case the Amba Alage or the Amba Alage case, the Mekele case. But Adwa was the very finale of the interaction between the two powers, and the end of the game concluded that the Ethiopians of the time defeated the most armed, strong colonial white army that makes Ethiopia's identity as representative or as a basic protagonist of Africa's identity started then. Then, beginning to after the First World War, when the countries of the world, the main actors, proposed a kind of international organization that would supposedly facilitate peaceful relation between states of the world, the League of Nations was founded, and Ethiopia was the only African state to represent black identity on the stage of the League of Nations. This is one point that still Ethiopia was the only anti-colonial power within the forum of colonialists. You see, the League of Nations can be described as it is a forum or an association or a kind of organization of the colonialists. The other thing that Ethiopia represented in Africa was that some European colonial economists or economic scholars believe that Africa was a very backward, archaic continent in which even no major economic structure has been developed rather than pastoralism. So many economic historians argue that there was no even feudalism in African continent, but a group, pretty handful of even European scholars argue against this idea that Ethiopia was the only place in African continent where feudalism, and a very typical feudalism, has developed, which is very, can say it is developed than slavery or pastoralism as compared. Coming to the other thing, since the formation of African organizations that united scholars of Africa during the late 20th century and the beginning of the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the Pan-African movement, its foundation is on the very base of the Adwa victory that Ethiopia defeated, or the blacks defeated the whites. That was very important, that Europeans cannot deny it, and still they were the first to accept Ethiopia's freedom. And Italy, the country that fought Ethiopia and defeated in the Battle of Adwa, was the first European country to open its embassy or its legation in Addis Ababa, soon, some 11 months after the battle itself.
You've mentioned some important instances in the history of Ethiopia's perception with African countries as a patron of Africa's freedom, for instance. Like, how has that period shaped its modern-day foreign relations? How would you put it?
Ethiopia's freedom is meaningless unless it has been supported by other brothers and sisters in African countries, in other African nations. So Ethiopia was not only a champion of its own freedom, Ethiopia also have struggled for the freedom of other nations, other peoples or other states in Africa. We can say that, for example, despite change of regimes, despite government changes in Africa, Ethiopia's state policy has been constant towards Africa's freedom. We can, for example, mention that in the formation of the OAU itself, there have been several groups, latter come together into three major groups. This is the Casablanca group, the Brazzaville group, and the Monrovia group, in which finally a very strong diplomatic effort and his charismatic quality, Emperor Haile Selassie, finally won the African Union on the shape that many even states of the time, like Ghana was the first colonial African states won independence from colonialism. So they come together and come as that Ethiopia's long history of statehood was the example of Africa's freedom would be in the future at the time. So as a result, Ethiopia supported the national liberation movement in several African countries.
All right, so what has been a long-standing feature of Ethiopia's diplomatic journey in Africa, besides its standing for its freedom, etc.? My question here is in terms of who are the primary actors engaged in the foreign relations or the diplomacy of Ethiopia in terms of dealing with other African countries, and what has been the centerpiece for those actors to engage with other African countries?
Good. You see, Ethiopia's independence and Ethiopia's freedom for long has contributed for its freedom to send even what we call the pioneers of change. Some of the early reformist intellectuals that Ethiopia had starting from the 20th century, Ethiopia's freedom allowed it to send its young generation, very brilliant generation, to Europe, to Russia, to different parts of the world. And they come up with the idea of change. And this is one diplomatic stand that Ethiopia's intellectual movement is one actor, that I said. The other major actors that we can say in the relation to Ethiopia's unwavering stand against this white domination in African continent was after, you see, the change of government, every government regime in and regime out in Ethiopia, government leaders or head of states usually play a strong card that Ethiopia is behind all freedom of African people, both economically and politically. That was very important points. The other point that I want to raise under this one, that Ethiopia's relationship with the newly independent African countries since the 1960s, it was not easy because of these countries, or Ethiopians do not have the knowledge of these colonial boundaries. But these neighboring states around Ethiopia, all of them have colonial boundaries. These colonial boundaries were not actually on the place or on the ground, rather than they were on papers. As a result, every time new state won independence, they come against Ethiopia on the pretext that the colonialist or colonial education policies taught them that their boundary is far greater than deep into Ethiopia than demarcated on the map. As a result, Ethiopia has a problem with new neighbors around Ethiopia, with the Sudan, with the Somalia, in particularly the two states, the British and the Italian Somaliland, and the Sudan under British rule. So year in, year out, this was the issue. This would help them that Ethiopia, as a champion of Africa's or black identity, should remain poor, not to be very much, if Ethiopia go out of, or what you can say, Ethiopia's political freedom, supported by economic strength, economic power, that would be very difficult for the European countries to easily manipulate under the pretext of aid, support, or with military intervention and so on. The other point with this military issue in mind, let me take to Ethiopia's role representing Africa in world peacekeeping, starting from the very beginning, from the League of Nations. As I told you, the League of Nations was a forum of colonial powers, but Ethiopia there as anti-colonial power in that. When I say power, power is relative. Ethiopia's power may not be very rich in dollars, may not be very big, but it has a military power that proved its identity, that proved its freedom. So, starting from the Congo crisis, or even from the Korean crisis, from the Korean War, under the League of Nations, Ethiopia contributed the peacekeeping contingents. And even within Africa also, Ethiopia played a very great role, unsurpassed role, I can say, in the Congo, in the Rwandan crisis, in the Liberian crisis. Even Ethiopia also mediated different conflicts. For example, Emperor Haile Selassie has successfully mediated the war and the conflict between Algeria and Morocco over boundary problems. Emperor Haile Selassie also mediated the problem of Morocco over its claimed territory known as the Sahrawi Republic. And although this crisis finally moved to, or went to the extent of dragging Morocco out of the African Union, still it's returned back, but Ethiopia still kept its promise that it should keep independence of any society whenever they claim. What can conclude about Ethiopia has a national interest. Every state had to keep its national interest. So in addition to its national interest, Ethiopia had another double interest, that the continental interest. All Ethiopian states, regimes that we have seen, for example, from the imperial regime to military regime to the EPRDF regime, they have their own unchanging, constant support for Africa's independence, and still the incumbent regime is also asking that Africa must get permanent seat in the Security Council of the United Nations. And this United Nations should keep its charter very clearly, because under the Charter of the United Nations, every member states are equal and they have equal voice. But this Security Council, the 5 countries, the veto power thing, still it is a very huge crisis for the Union itself. So Africa, 54 nations, Africa big, the second biggest continent, about 1.3 billion people, they do not have any permanent seat at the Security Council of the UN. This should be reformed. It is a matter of 1.3 billion people and the planet's richest continent in terms of resources, whatever. And so this, we can maybe coming to this Ethiopia's very idle issue, or its prominent role, its geographic location, Africa's water tower, being Ethiopia has the highest water tower, and its relation with along the Red Sea and the Gulf of Eden, very closer to the Middle East, and as headquarters of Africa still. So these are two very important opportunities. It should be wisely used, otherwise it may have also consequences.
So you've mentioned the strategic importance of Ethiopia, and we know the importance it has for Western powers, and maybe as well as the Horn of Africa countries, because we're so close and share boundaries. But how has it been, I wonder, how has it impacted the relationship with other African countries, say, for instance, in the south or in the west? Has it been significant, and if so, in what ways has it been important?
Yes, location, resources, this population factor, economic factor, different factors plays countries' foreign policy priority issues. Now, if we directly connect Ethiopia's relation with the Middle East, it's almost the issue of the Nile. Ethiopia is blessed with it being the source of major rivers that flowing from the water tower of the Eastern Africa. So this Ethiopia's resources has been maybe used by other powers as a curse rather than as a blessing. Why? It is because if Ethiopia use these resources, Ethiopia will be very rich, or maybe middle income earning country very soon. This will also help in turn to its growth economically, its population, its location. So to make Ethiopia keep poor, disintegrated, destabilized, and where it is, this is the policy that, the old policy that the European powers used, particularly the colonial powers around the Horn of Africa, the British, the French, the Italians that surrounded around Africa, they used this. Even this idea is inherited by some states in Africa who struggled against colonialism. They are very much crying for colonial treaties, colonial agreements, for example. Take, for example, the 1929 or the 1959 agreement on the Nile. It is a colonial agreement. I wonder how Egypt, who is anti-colonial or who have tested the burden of colonialism. Of course, Egypt has a very long history of rule under foreign since for thousands of years, but still Egypt keeps signing or citing at the 1929 or 1959 water agreements whenever Ethiopia's right to use its resources ever is mentioned. This is one point. So the strategic location issue is not very simple. It is not very easy. It determines all European or American or major world actors, even the East, like the Chinese or the Russians or any power that wanted to have a good relation with Africa, want Ethiopia. One, because Ethiopia's location is very strategic with the big waters, the Gulf of Aden, the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea. It is not far from Europe. It is simply an hour's flight from here to Europe. So this all is one very strategic advantage that Ethiopia has. The other thing is Ethiopia is very blessed with natural resources, maybe particularly metallic minerals and water. The issue of water, very soon we can say that the significance of petroleum as world source of energy will soon end when the zero emission energy or environmental friendly energy utilization will become the true and the priority of the World Economic Energy Forum. You see, they know that if Ethiopians will use the Nile water, they will win over poverty, and this will help Ethiopia to use more energy stations or to more water that flowing to different directions. That is why the cry is heard from very distant because of this. Otherwise, Ethiopia is not the only country that have dams on international rivers. What we can see, national interest should be the priority agenda of every Ethiopian. They may have political differences, that is welcome, no problem with that. But national priority agenda or national interest should not be compromised in any kind of relation with outside world. For example, a party X, if wanted to come to power by taking the place of the current, how it can be how it can win the people of Ethiopia without keeping Ethiopia's interest by siding with Ethiopia's enemies. This can be a fallacy by itself. See, as a result, what you can say that as the regimes that will always take power that we have seen in our earlier discussion, even political differences or political groups should have national interest as a priority agenda in their whatever relationship with outside power. So the other thing that what would be this, the water politics, the hydro politics, the Nile Valley politics, it has a very strong influence, not only in Ethiopia, but also on the whole of the African continent. As I told you earlier, Nile is not the only river that flows within many African countries. We can take the Niger case or the Congo River case. So Africans should have similar stand despite different differences or despite they do not have direct benefit from the dam or whatever project that Ethiopia construct on the Nile or on the Wabi Shebele or on the Omo or on the Awash or on every. So this will help their future, that the future generation of Africans, despite regardless of their wherever they are, they will give the chance that the next generation will freely use their resource within their borders for their people.
As a final parting question, I want to ask you, you've also mentioned, and it's known that Ethiopia has been a forerunner in joining organizations or, opening them up. And one example of that is the OAU, which has later changed into the AU or the African Union. So you've mentioned the mindset that there was back then in terms of joining those organizations. But let me ask you, is it the same now? And as well as, what has it done for its diplomatic presence in the whole of Africa?
Yeah, it's a very nice point that Ethiopia is not only a very strong forerunner of OAU, but also AU is under the terms that the Ethiopian leaders of the time have said, that still it's kept its promise that Ethiopia will continue to play its role as a leader of Africa's freedom, Africa's identity, see, Africa's black identity. Very recently, what is going on is that, with the disagreement, with the instabilities, or with some kind of political issues in the country, that Ethiopia's role as, as what you call forerunner of Africa's Union may be under question when we hear voices from other countries. Oh, this country is keeping in mess. She cannot stabilize itself. She cannot play this role, expected role in African politics, in African diplomatic point. However, this is not easy, I understand, but still politicians and Ethiopian diplomats, Ethiopia was very also lucky to have a very well-versed diplomats, individuals, personalities like Kefle Wadajo were very known, personalities like Yilma Deresa in history, they were very known. The current ambassadors of Ethiopia to even the president of Ethiopia at the time is also a very good diplomat, that she has a very good profile of that. We can say that the present Ethiopian diplomatic community, or they have to work very strong. They have to convince their brothers and sisters, African brothers and sisters, that Ethiopia's problem is internal, that is nothing external. Other countries that want to use this opportunity for their own advantage, like the Sudan issue, like the Egypt issue, is the issue of the water. Water and internal issues are different. Even the water itself is water that originates from Ethiopian soil, not from Egypt. So we want that our brothers and sisters in Egypt want to drink, we not want to trust them, but you see, it should be logical. The river will flow, no problem of that, but it will be at their own loss if they want to use their political calculation to capitalize on Ethiopia's internal problems. To help this, many African diplomats of different parts of Africa, all the 54 countries, should help Ethiopia in political issues. And many of them are helping when we see recently the United Nations has called for dozens of meetings on issues regarding Ethiopia's internal condition. Many African countries stand with Ethiopia. Many other even international friends like the Chinese and the Russians stand with Ethiopia because they believe that this is Ethiopian internal issue. And Ethiopia also should give free places for table round conferences always the time. In history we know that every conflict comes to end with a table round conference. Whatever, even the war of the history's longest war, the 100 Years War, come to end. It is fought between European countries. We don't have the history of long war like them, but history changes, the time changes. So even any big wars like the First World War, like the 100 Years War, or like the 30 Years War, or the Second World War, which is very much destructive in human history, finally ended with a table round. So Ethiopians must put their problems to the table, discuss on it, and give the priority for public interest rather than interest of the long hands behind them. So this will help Ethiopia to prevail, Ethiopia to play its prominent role in African diplomatic history.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Kafel. You've touched upon some complex topics and gave us a deep insight of Ethiopia's diplomatic history. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You are welcome. Thank you.
All right, well, that brings today's diplomatic insight to the end. We've looked at the diplomatic history of Ethiopia in the African continent, how the past has shaped the present, and what the roles are, and how they've changed and how they've evolved so far. I've stayed with Dr. Kafel Tasamma, and I was Kirana Baina leading today's program. Until next time.